Welcome to the podcast, There's But a Scratch, Fact and Fiction About the Middle Ages. I'm your host, Professor Richard Abels. On October 14th, 959 years ago, one of the very few truly decisive medieval battles was fought along a ridge 6 or 7 miles northwest of the town of Hastings. The battle began around 9 a.m. and lasted all day. By day's end, the English king, Harold Godwinson, and his brothers Earls Leofwin and Gurth lay dead on the battlefield, and Duke William the Bastard of Normandy had earned a far more flattering nickname, William the Conqueror. In this episode, we will explore the significance of the Norman Conquest in English history. I can think of no one better as a co-host for this than my good friend, Dr. Jenny Paxton of the Catholic University of America. As I'm sure you remember, Jenny was my co-host for our 2 episodes on the events leading up to the Battle of Hastings and the Norman Conquest itself. If you haven't listened to them, you might want to give them a try. This episode will still be streaming when you get back. We're not going to refight the Battle of Hastings in this episode. Been there, done that. Instead, we're going to look at the impact that the Norman Conquest had on English history. Jenny, I'm so pleased to have you back.
It's wonderful to be back, Richard.
So, Jenny, what dates in American history might you expect all American high school students to know?
All American students? I never thought you were that optimistic, but I would say that most would say maybe 1776 and maybe 1492 and 9/11, though they might not be able to tell you the year, as scary as that sounds.
Yeah, I think you're right. Well, in 1930, when 2 British humorists, W.C. Seller and R.J. Yeatman, decided to send up all of English history, they chose as a title for their book, 1066 and All That, A Memorable History of England, comprising all the parts you can remember, including 103 good things, 5 bad kings, and 2 genuine dates. As they explained, 1066 was the one date that they could expect all British schoolboys to know.
Well, we will leave the gender stuff apart for a moment and just say that that is an absolutely wonderful book. It is still hilarious, and the more you know about English history, the funnier it is.
Yeah.
And among the things they got right is the title. 1066 might not be the beginning of English history, and given Richard's area of specialization, I am sure that he would agree. Any of us who think that the Anglo-Saxon period is pretty important would have a problem with that. But it does mark a significant turning point in that country's history, and I am sure that Richard would agree with that as well.
I agree entirely with both. We Anglo-Saxon historians sometimes bristle at the idea that everything worthwhile knowing about England begins with 1066, and we also tend to argue for a greater degree of continuity across that divide than at least the Victorian historians believe. But it would be a mistake to minimize the impact of the Norman Conquest and the Norman settlement that followed it on English governance, English society, English culture, religion, and even landscape and diet.
Yes, I really do think that it's possible to take the minimization of the conquest too far. And I'm glad that you added the Norman settlement into the list of things that are important about the conquest. Just to be clear, 1066 marks only the first step in a process that played out over 20 years at least.
At least. Ellen reminded me when we were doing the last couple of episodes that when teaching a class or giving a lecture or doing a history podcast, it's best to begin with an overview that explains where we will be going and why we are going there. It's too easy for an audience, even those who love history, to get lost in a torrent of names and dates without knowing why they were hearing them. So let's begin with a brief overview of what we think is the real historical significance of the Norman Conquest. Why don't you begin, Jenny?
The most obvious change is in the composition of the English aristocracy and landholding class. Within 20 years of the conquest, the old English nobility had virtually been replaced by Normans and other Frenchmen.
Calculate that maybe 5% of the land remains in the hands of native landowners.
It's a really astonishing statistic. It's what I've seen too.
Much of this land passed into Norman hands through royal grants. When William confiscated the lands of Englishmen who fell in the Battle of Hastings or in the several native rebellions that followed, he distributed them to his loyal Norman and French followers. Just as the king claimed to be the legitimate heir to King Edward the Confessor, so these Norman lords were to hold these lands with the rights and obligations to the crown of their former English owners. But in the 20 years that followed the conquest, how land was held as well as who held it changed. A generation ago, historians of the period will tell you that the greatest of these changes was the introduction of feudalism. If you've listened to my episode on the medieval historian's F word, you won't be surprised that that is now a matter of debate. But that land tenure and lordship in 1086 were profoundly different from what they had been in 1066, I think that's beyond question. Although these changes should probably be understood as gradual and emerging from the Norman settlement, rather than a sort of invasive species. Kingship, royal governance, and lordship were also changed by the conquest. As king by conquest, William enjoyed far more land and power than had either King Harold Godwinson or Edward the Confessor. Anglo-Saxon legal and administrative institutions survived the conquest, at least in form, but they also changed during the turbulent scramble for land that characterizes the Norman settlement. The character not only of royal but personal lordship also changed with the introduction of an entirely new foreign ruling class. And as Jenny's work has shown, the Norman conquest also had a profound effect upon the English church.
I'm going to argue that the English church was transformed in many very obvious ways after the conquest, such as the total changeover in church leadership and the building of new cathedrals. But I will also argue that the newly transformed church drew very much on its Anglo-Saxon roots.
And we will also see that the Norman conquest had a profound impact upon the English landscape, with the proliferation of castles, the growth of towns and villages in association with those castles, and the establishment of royal hunting forests. The conquest also led to changes in husbandry, economics, and diet. And of course, the Norman conquest meant English kings and the English aristocracy would be connected to France linguistically, culturally, and politically for the remainder of the Middle Ages. Okay, if one says 1776 to an American audience, I think what immediately comes to mind is the Declaration of Independence. And if you said 1066, especially to a British audience, what would immediately come to mind is the Battle of Hastings. And following that would be the Norman Conquest. But the two are not the same. Military historians love battles. Battle of Hastings is, just so important. 1066 was important for that. But William knew better than to think that one battle had gained him the throne of England. Harold Godwinson and two of his brothers were dead. But that didn't mean that he had won England. As soon as the Battle of Hastings had been won, William set his sights on London, but he didn't want to head straight for the capital. He wanted to prepare the ground first because a frontal assault on London was a bad idea. It was a walled city and could have held out for a long time. So William made a big arc to the northwest of London, harrying and burning as he went along. This had multiple purposes. By doing this, he provisioned his army. That is what we mean when military historians say living off of the land.
It's a wonderful euphemism, isn't it?
It is really. It was also meant to convince the English, who still resisted, that William meant business. Finally, it isolated London from reinforcements. If you have burned a lot of supplies in the area immediately around the city, it's hard for that city to hang on in a siege. So that was the military approach.
But William was also a very smart politician. At the same time as he was out taking care of the military side of the operation, he was putting out feelers to prominent English leaders, both noblemen and churchmen, to see if they might be willing to come over to his side. And one by one, the English leaders did this. And I think they began to see an inevitability about William's conquest, and they didn't manage to unite against him. Archbishop Stigand, that questionable Archbishop of Canterbury, who had been kind of a little bit of the excuse for getting papal support for the Norman Conquest, he was one of the leaders to offer his allegiance. And after toying with the possibility of elevating Edgar Atheling, the young grandson of King Athelred the Unready,
and a guy whom I know you admire so much.
Oh, yeah, he's my favorite medieval doofus. Earls Morcar and Edwin and the other English magnates gathered in London and bowed to the inevitable. A few days before Christmas 1066, William of Normandy peacefully entered the English capital to receive the submission of the English nobles, and he was crowned in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day.
Yeah, but you know something? That coronation didn't go so well.
It did not go according to plan.
Yeah.
Not at all.
Yeah, the shouting of the English in jubilation for a new king was taken as being the sounds of rebellion, and the Normans slaughtered a whole bunch of English people.
And set fire to the houses around the abbey, which I've never really understood why they thought that was a good idea.
Other than that, it was a perfectly good coronation.
Yeah, it was brilliant. He was crowned in Westminster Abbey, and 6 months later, King William felt secure enough to return to his Duchy of Normandy. He left us as regents his half-brother, Bishop Odo of Bayeux, and his trusted friend and advisor, Earl William Fitz-Osbern.
Now, that shows where William's priorities really lay. He spent about 3/4 of his reign in Normandy. England gave him prestige. It's a lot more prestigious to be a king than a duke, especially when you're trying to deal with a feudal overlord who is also a king, King Philip I of France. And England was also a cash cow. It was a wealthy nation. But for almost his entire tenure as Duke of Normandy, William was fighting to secure his duchy's borders against Counts of Anjou and kings of France, and he still was doing it after he became King of England.
It's always been true throughout the period when the English kings had possessions in France that they were more worried about their possessions in France. Yeah. They were always less secure.
Maybe it's because they spoke French.
Oh, well. Now, not that England was all that secure. He almost immediately had to sail back to England to deal with a rebellion in the city of Exeter in the southwest.
Yeah. The southwest had not been subdued. King Harold Godwinson's mother, Githa Thorkelsdottir, what a wonderful name.
It is a great name.
Had taken refuge in Exeter, where she awaited the arrival of her surviving sons. When William learned of this, he demanded that the townsmen of Exeter submit to him.
And also pay the taxes he levied.
Yeah, and pay the heavy taxes he levied on his new subjects. And guess what? They refused. So what William responded was by crossing the Channel in December of 1067, which itself shows that this is really a serious matter. You don't really want to cross the Channel in the middle of winter. No. So he crosses the Channel in 1067, raised an army, and laid siege to Exeter. After 18 days, the city fell. Githa and her main supporters, however, managed to escape capture. Harold Godwinson's sons from their base in Ireland soon after launched a couple of Viking-style raids along the coast of England, but these were easily driven off, and with that, they sort of fade away from history.
Now, would you permit me a quick Irish digression?
Yes.
Okay, so here's an irony of history. So the kingdom in Ireland in which Harold Godwinson's sons took refuge was the Kingdom of Leinster.
Oh, really?
Yes, it was.
We know what that means.
It does indeed, because that is the kingdom that really begins the English invasion of Ireland in the 12th century, because it is the effort of King of Leinster to get put back on the throne with English help that kicks off the whole long, convoluted history of English involvement in Ireland.
So take that, Irish.
Well,
yeah,
because they had tried to help the sons
of Godwinson.
Yeah. Now, while this was going on, there is also stuff going on in England too. So Adric the Wild, a kinsman of the notorious Earl Adric Streuna, was leading a rebellion in Herefordshire in alliance with the Welsh princes of Gwynedd and Powys. So that's northern and central Wales. That rebellion was put down by the Norman garrison of Hereford Castle, but it wasn't until 1069 that Adric and his rebel forces were finally forced to submit and swear allegiance to King William.
So 2 years into William the Conqueror's reign, his authority was fairly secure.
At least temporarily. We can't forget Hereward the Wake.
Who can? But I think it's fair to say that William thought he had things pretty well under control, at least south of the Humber. Northumberland was another matter completely.
Now, to be fair, Anglo-Saxon kings themselves had had difficulty ruling Northumbria.
Yeah.
The north of England was just different. It was a native Northumbrian rebellion against Earl Tostig and West Saxon rule in 1065 that forms the backdrop for King Harold Hardrada's invasion in 1066, because that, of course, is the reason that Tostig allies with Harold Hardrada.
Against his own brother.
Indeed.
Yeah. In the summer of 1068, the English lords in Northumbria rebelled. William marched north and built a castle at Warwick, then at Nottingham. When the resistance leaders at York saw this, they decided to negotiate. William marched into York, built the inevitable castle. He kept on building castles and turned south, building castles at Lincoln, Huntingdon, and Cambridge. In late 1068, William returned again to Normandy.
But the king's newly appointed Norman Earl of Bamborough, Robert de Commons, apparently allowed his followers to ravage the lands of his earldom unchecked. In response, a group of rebels forced their way into Durham, where Robert was staying with the bishop, and began killing all the Normans they could find, then burned the bishop's house down with Robert inside.
Sounds a little bit like Tostig's experience, doesn't it?
Only it ended a lot worse.
A lot worse, yeah.
Now, people began to flock to the rebels. They gathered at York, and they summoned Edgar Atheling from Scotland, where he had taken refuge.
The feckless Edgar Atheling, a man singularly lacking in political or military ability, but with the best hereditary claim to the English throne.
It's true. I mean, if you look at the genealogy, he should be the guy.
He should.
He had absolutely zero competence and ability, but his ancestry alone made him a real threat, especially at the head of a full-scale Northumbrian revolt. So William hurried back to England. He's kind of, going back and forth across the channel all the time.
They needed to shuttle back then.
They did. That would have helped. So he appeared at York with a huge force, routed the rebels, built a second castle in the city, but the leaders of the revolt had escaped, and of course, Edgar Atheling fled back to Scotland.
Okay, to be fair to Edgar Atheling, he did have one very valuable ability. He knew how to survive.
This guy you could not kill. And the King of Scotland, Malcolm Canmore, not only gave Edgar refuge, but he married Edgar's sister, Margaret. And that gave King Malcolm of Scotland a stake in seeing that Edgar Atheling became King of England, because of course it would be very helpful if Malcolm Canmore had the King of England as a brother-in-law.
Yeah. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, for the D and the E recensions, emphasize how reluctant Margaret was to get married and how reluctant Edgar was to allow her to marry the king, but he didn't have really a choice.
Well, if you think about it, the kings of Scotland in this period were not necessarily seen as a fantastic catch.
No, not really.
No, I mean, and Margaret then had to do a lot to sort of try to bring Scotland up to her standards.
Yep.
Which she tried to do. Now, new rebels joined the cause, and then the Danes arrived.
Yay.
King Sweyn Estridsson of Denmark was the cousin of King Harthacnut and claimed a right to the English throne. He sent a fleet led by his brother and his son. The Danes and the English rebels stormed York, captured both castles, and massacred the garrisons. But as soon as William reappeared, resistance collapsed. And I want to pause here and just think for a second about the importance of William's personal presence.
Yes.
So if you think about back to the Battle of Hastings itself, the pivotal moment when he makes clear that he has not been killed in the battle, and that's what prevents his troops from losing heart and routing. And here, the mere appearance of William causes the loss of heart of the rebels.
His reputation at this point was at its height, and William must have been charismatic. He must have been. But he was, as charismatic as he was even more brutal when it came to his enemies. William put down this revolt with a brutality that shocked even contemporaries. His army marched through Yorkshire and Durham, and they systematically burned fields and killed livestock. Now, in itself, this isn't unusual. Ravaging and sieges were the most common military activities in 11th and 12th century warfare. But even by the standards of the time, what William did to the Northumbrians was memorably horrifying. A generation later, the Anglo-Norman historian Orderic Vitalis, who was of mixed heritage, wrote the following, quote, "The king stopped at nothing to hunt his enemies. He cut down many people and destroyed homes and land. Nowhere else had he shown such cruelty, and to his shame he made no effort to control his fury, and he punished the innocent with the guilty. He ordered that crops and herds, tools and food should be burnt to ashes. More than 100,000 people perished of hunger. I have often praised William in this book, but I can say nothing good about his brutal slaughter. God will punish him." King William's great land register Domesday Book bears witness to this devastation. The economy of Yorkshire had not fully recovered even 20 years after the harrying of the North.
And that is a really amazing statistic.
It really is.
And I just think it's wonderful what Orderic does there. He is basically saying, look, don't consider me to be somebody who is unfair or biased against William. I've often said that some of the stuff he did was good, but this was not good.
This is a bad thing.
Yes. By January 1070, William had restored order in Yorkshire and Durham, but there were also rebels in Cheshire near the Welsh border, and here's when he does something that is characteristic of the kind of energy that he has. He undertakes an impossible wintertime march across the Pennine Mountains. And let me just pause and say here for a second that the impossibility of doing this is part of what allows the Jacobite rebels to escape back to Scotland in the early winter of 1746. So you are not supposed to be able to cross the Pennines in the winter.
You know, what William of Poitiers likes to compare William to Julius Caesar, especially in Caesar's invasion of Britain. And the quality that William has here is very much the same quality that Julius Caesar. These impossible marches, these ability to do things that mean that the enemy never expects the arrival of your troops because nobody can do this.
It's basically the whole idea that everybody knows the rules about winter campaigning.
Yes.
But really tremendous commanders can break those rules.
Yes.
And William was one of those. So he arrives in rebel territory completely unexpectedly, and he wins the campaign without needing to fight at all. He just shows up and that's it. So William harries Cheshire, just as he had harried in the north, and he has himself recrowned by a papal legate at Easter. This sort of ceremonial crown wearing is kind of a way of saying, no, really, I'm king.
Yeah. There was one more big push by rebels in the summer of 1070, and that took place in the fenlands of eastern England, and they were led by a really shadowy figure who goes down in history as Hereward the Wake.
Well, we are now in my territory.
Yes.
This is where I really like to hang out, in the Fenlands. So Hereward seems to have been a minor English nobleman from Lincolnshire who lost his lands after the conquest. So he has one of these grievances about the conquest. His story, as we have it now, is full of legendary elements.
Yes.
It is, full of things that are probably not really accurate, but we do know that he took refuge in the monastery of Ely, and William besieged him. And just to set the scene, the monastery of Ely was really kind of on an island in a very marshy area, so it was defensible. Ultimately, Hereward surrendered, and some evidence suggests that he got a royal pardon and lived the rest of his days in quiet obscurity, which is not really the most dramatic and romantic way that story could end. But with the native rebellions eradicated, William could turn his attention to Scotland. So remember, Scotland is hovering out there back from the time when that royal marriage had been contracted. In 1072, William made an agreement with King Malcolm to acknowledge William's overlordship of Scotland. And this is because, William has so much power that he's just demonstrated in the north that Malcolm cannot afford to have him as a hostile neighbor on his southern border.
That overlordship is going to create problems later.
Oh my goodness, is it ever. Basically, we're just predicting Braveheart right now.
Yeah, we really are.
Now, one part of the deal was that Malcolm had to expel his brother-in-law, Edgar Atheling, from his court. Now, of course, Edgar is the ultimate survivor, and so he finds refuge in the court of yet another enemy of William the Conqueror, Count Robert the Frisian of Flanders. So he basically is the exile tour.
Yes.
Goes every place in exile that you could possibly go.
Yeah, he'll eventually end up as the bosom friend of William the Conqueror's eldest son, Robert, and go on crusade with him.
And be captured in battle. And be the son is held in captivity for the rest of his life. Edgar Atheling dies in his bed.
Yes.
It's amazing, that guy.
It's really wonderful. So, a final rebellion took place in 1075, but this was led by Norman and French lords. It was led by Earl Ralph of Hertfordshire and the Breton Earl Ralph de Gale of East Anglia. It wasn't led by native Englishmen.
Although, ironically, the only leader of this rebellion, whom King William ordered to be executed, was the one Englishman, the last English Earl, Waltheof of Northumbria.
Which remains a puzzle. The plot was hatched at the marriage feast of Earl Roger to the sister of Earl Ralph. Both seem to have been resentful that the king had not granted them all the land's power and favor enjoyed by their fathers. Earl Waltheof was certainly at the feast and was complicit in some way, but why and how much was debated at the time and in the generation after. Waltheof was the son of Siward, Earl of Northumbria, one of the most powerful magnates in King Edward the Confessor's England. In 1065, 10 years after his father's death, Waltheof was made Earl of Northamptonshire and Huntingdonshire. He submitted to William soon after the Battle of Hastings and was permitted to continue to enjoy his lands and his offices. But in 1069, he was among the northern lords who joined King Sweyn II of Denmark's invasion of Yorkshire. When that invasion failed, he once again submitted to William. Not only did the king restore him to his pre-conquest earldom, but he gave him his niece Judith in marriage. It proved to be an unhappy marriage, as we're going to see. In 1072, he replaced his cousin, Gospatrick, as Earl of Northumbria. Why he would have joined Earls Roger and Ralph in rebellion in 1075 is far from clear. It's even questionable whether he did. It's certain that he did not provide any military support to the rebellion, and at least one source has him exposing the plot to the regent, Archbishop Lanfranc, who conveyed the information to King William in Normandy, who crossed the channel and put down the rebellion. According to that story, Waltheof claimed that he had been compelled to join the plot by the other two earls who forced him to take an oath of silence. Only when the archbishop absolved him of his oath did he feel that he could report the treason. Even though Lanfranc apparently doubted Waltheof's guilt, the king ordered him to be arrested along with Roger and Ralph. But whereas he kept the latter two as prisoners, after a year's imprisonment, he ordered Waltheof to be executed. Waltheof was buried in Crowland Abbey. In 1092, after a fire in the abbey's chapter house, his tomb was opened, and the monks, to their amazement, discovered not only an uncorrupted corpse, but also that the severed head had been rejoined to the body. At least that was the story spread by the monks who stood to benefit from the pilgrims who came to visit the tomb. Although he was never canonized, Waltheof became a folk saint, and this seems to have influenced Waltheof's treatment in the accounts of his death by the early 12th century Anglo-Norman chroniclers John of Worcester, Henry of Huntingdon, and William of Malmesbury. The first two regarded him as an innocent victim. The latter was uncertain, as his Norman sources were clear that he was a traitor, and his English sources were equally certain that he was completely innocent. Why King William ordered him and not his Norman and Breton cohorts to be executed is far from clear. It may be that William had already forgiven Waltheof once after the Northern Revolt. Some suggest it was because his wife Judith, the king's niece, hated him, and one account of the exposure of the plot has Waltheof confessing it to Judith and Judith reporting it to Archbishop Lanfranc. Or it could be because Waltheof was the last of the pre-conquest earls, and William the Conqueror, in 1075, had it with native revolts. I know I've gone on a bit about Waltheof, but I think he deserves some attention because he was the last English earl, and 1075 can mark the end of at least the military part of the Norman Conquest, though not the Norman settlement. The two, as we will see, were intimately connected, as each of the uprisings resulted in large-scale confiscations of the lands, not only of the leaders of those revolts, but of their commended men, whether those men held their lands from these lords or not. Those confiscations were the legal means by which land and possessions passed from English into Norman hands. But the Norman nobles who settled England weren't satisfied with legal mechanisms. They were a kleptocracy.
A wonderful word. The rule of kleptomaniacs.
Yes. These new Norman lords looked to gobble up the lands of their lesser English neighbors and even those of weaker Norman landowners. Actually, the story of the unfortunate Waltheof is a good hook to get into the meat of this episode, the impact and significance of the Norman Conquest.
Now, before we turn to that, in the spirit of Seller and Gateman, let's talk a little bit about the historiography of the Norman Conquest.
Ah, the dreaded historiography word. Well, why don't you have a go at it?
Well, where to begin?
How about at the beginning? Okay, I'll start. I'll start with an assessment of at least one contemporary English witness, the monastic author of the Peterborough recension of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. His poetic obituary for William the Conqueror, included in the annal for 1087, which actually should have been, which is misstated to 1086, but is really for 1087, leaves little doubt of how the English thought of the last 20 years of rule under the Normans. I'm quoting now. He had castles built and poor men terribly oppressed. The king was severe, and he took many marks of gold and hundreds of pounds in silver from his underlings. All this he took from the people, and with great injustice from his subjects, out of trivial desire. He had fallen into avarice, and he loved greediness above everything else. He established many deer preserves, and he set up many laws concerning them, such that whoever killed a hart or a hind should be blinded. We're in Robin Hood territory here.
We are.
He forbade the hunting of harts and also of boars. He loved the wild deer as if he were their father. And he also decreed that the hares should be allowed to run free. His great men complained of it, and his poor men lamented it. But he was so severe that he ignored all their needs. But they had to follow above all else the king's will. If they wanted to live or hold on to the land or to property or esteem or have his good favor, woe that any man should be so proud as to raise himself up and reckon himself above all men. May Almighty God show mercy on his soul and forgive him his sins.
Monk or not, I have serious doubts about whether he meant that final sentence. And I think it really is kind of the monk equivalent of bless his heart.
Bless his heart. Well, in tennis, when players win a point, when the ball hits the net and then dribbles over the net, they almost always apologize. We call that a faux apology. This seems to me to be a forgiveness. Sorry, I couldn't resist that. Okay. How did Anglo-Norman historians like Orderic Vitalis, William of Malmesbury, Henry of Huntingdon assess the significance of the Norman Conquest?
Well, not all that differently, strangely enough. Looking back from his vantage point in the middle of the 12th century, Henry of Huntingdon wrote, in the 21st year of King William's reign, there was hardly a nobleman of English descent left in England, but all were reduced to servitude and mourning, so that it was a disgrace to be called an Englishman.
No, that's not really that much different from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles assessment of William's reign. But where I think it does differ, where Henry of Huntington's, Orderic Vitalis, William of Malmesbury, is in their explanation for why the Norman conquest actually occurred. They all seem to blame the English, and they blame the English for the sinfulness of the people, and that this is a divine judgment upon them. Very biblical.
Well, I think part of it is a way of trying to explain to themselves why it had happened.
Yeah.
I mean, because if you say it was our own fault, you kind of take some agency back.
Hey, that's interesting.
Yeah. But the Norman conquest really became a subject of historical interest in the 17th century. In the early 17th century in England, there was a fierce debate between the Stuart kings on the one hand and certain elements in the Parliament on the other. And this is the period of the English Civil War, when King Charles I was ultimately executed by a radical faction of the Parliament. The Stuart kings wanted to stress that Parliament only got its authority from royal power. Meanwhile, the Parliament was arguing essentially the opposite, that the king only got his authority from Parliament. So according to the Parliament, the king got his authority from the people by way of the people's representatives, and both sides used the Norman conquest to back up their arguments. The pro-Parliament side, led by a scholarly lawyer named Sir Edward Coke, took a very negative view of the Norman conquest. Coke believed that before 1066, England had enjoyed a kind of primitive democracy in which power had indeed flowed up from the people.
Teutonic democracy in the woods, in the forest.
Oh, yes, very much into that. In the 19th century, they would really love that part.
Yeah.
There were various Anglo-Saxon institutions, such as the local courts, that allowed basically for self-government. So it was all going great, basically. But then along came the Norman conquest, and Coke argued that the Norman conquest had brought a cruel tyranny to England. The new rulers were oppressive and arbitrary. They had swept aside those venerable Anglo-Saxon institutions of self-government, and they had imposed on England a Norman yoke of oppression.
And, at this point, they bring in Magna Carta as being an attempt to restore the ancient Anglo-Saxon liberties, and that gets ignored by the Stuart kings.
Absolutely, and it's just as much a misinterpretation of Magna Carta as it is of the Norman conquest. But so we've just given you the most extreme statement of the pro-English, anti-Norman view of the conquest, and it certainly fit the agenda of the pro-Parliament side in the 17th century, because they're making a direct analogy between the Norman oppressors of the 11th century and the Stuart kings of the 17th century. So James I, Charles I, people like this, they are the new William the Conqueror. So if you make the Norman conquest look bad, and then you say the Stuart kings are just like the Normans, then that's going to help you make your case.
Absolutely. The royalist side, and this is naturally, of course, the royalist side took a very different view. According to the king's supporters, the Norman conquest had brought enlightened royal rule to England for the very first time. The Norman kings had brought in all sorts of innovations that were very beneficial to England, and they had gotten rid of a lot of Anglo-Saxon baggage that was outdated and unhelpful. The government of England had only been enhanced by the imposition of stronger royal institutions. This is the extreme statement of the pro-Norman, anti-English view of the conquest. It's also J.H. Round's view of the conquest
at the
end of the 19th century. The royalists were really saying that both the Norman kings of the 11th century and the Stuart kings of the 17th century were enlightened despots. And in the language of Sellers and Yeatman, that was a good thing. Capital G, capital T.
It definitely was. And I'll just add that there was a religious dimension to this dispute as well, because in the 17th century, there's a split between very, very high church Anglicans who were supporting the king and more radical Protestants. And these more radical Protestants saw the church in England before 1066 as less papal.
Right. That the Norman Conquest brings England into the bosom of the Roman Catholic Church.
And of course, they do point out that William's invasion had been papally approved.
Yes.
Which in the 17th century is not a good thing.
Yeah, it's a proto-crusade.
Right. Now, of course, this whole argument isn't really about 1066. It's not really about Magna Carta. It's about England itself in the 17th century. It's one of those great instances you can point to where people are using history for their own purposes in a contemporary political argument.
Really? I'm completely shocked.
I've seen it happen.
Really? God, okay.
So both sides are trying to use the Norman Conquest for their own political advantage, and both are really stretching the evidence much farther than it could really go. Now, it's no surprise that neither of these two versions of the conquest is accurate.
Wow.
The Norman yoke is an exaggeration, but so is the royalist view that the Normans brought civilization and enlightened rule to England for the first time. And I would be surprised if Richard had a problem with me poking a hole in that, right? But this whole debate should tell us right away how important the conquest was to English people. The meaning of it really mattered. People believed that they could use specific views of the conquest to help defend a particular political point of view in the present. It means that the conquest is very much on people's minds, ready to be weaponized.
And in the 17th century, the Norman Conquest became this center for dispute, for debate, because of political reasons. In the 18th century, interest in the Norman Conquest died down as the advocates of liberty and democracy abandoned the appeal to history. They saw no need to justify the supremacy of Parliament by citing its ancient pedigree and argued instead that democratic institutions were the product of enlightenment and modernity rather than a return to the past, and that the English Constitution, as it emerged, was a very good thing. But in the 19th century, interest in the Norman Conquest came back with a vengeance.
It did, but now it was more about culture than politics. You don't have these big political disputes anymore. They've kind of settled the whole constitutional question. But in the early 19th century in England, the English were not feeling very positive towards the French. Think about what had just been happening in the early part of the century. We're looking at the era of the Napoleonic Wars. Yep. And in 1815, when they win the Battle of Waterloo, it's a little bit about undoing that conquest because they had actually repelled an invasion threat. So it's kind of like undoing it.
No, I always thought it was about the French's tendency of taunting the English with incredibly hurtful taunts like, I unclogged my nose in your direction, sons of a window dresser, you tiny-brained wipers of other people's bottoms. I'm sorry. I just saw Monty Python and the Holy Grail again for the umpteenth time, this time with John Cleese giving his own commentary on it and saying he thought that the end of it was completely a waste because he didn't have one laugh for the final 8 minutes.
Huh. Well, I still think it's brilliant.
Yeah.
All right. So I am jealous that you just saw it again.
Yeah.
Because we just showed it at Catholic and I wasn't able to attend.
Oh.
But it'll be next year. We do it every year. At any rate, while the English were putting a hate on for the French, they were feeling a lot better about the Germans.
Not surprising, given that the House of Hanover was German and that the Germans were their allies in the Napoleonic War.
And that pretty much everybody that the English royal family married in this period were Germans as well, including the famous Prince Albert.
Yeah, and when we say cultural, we should also probably say racial, because there
there is definitely that.
Yeah.
This is a little bit of the uglier side of the 19th century.
It is.
All right, so we have Prince Albert. He's a German prince, a very minor German prince. No insult to him, but this is the period when he has a huge cultural impact on England. For example, The popularization of Christmas trees is down to him. Now, at this time, scholars and the general public associated the Anglo-Saxons with the Germans. The flip side of this, though, is that many of them strongly associated the Normans, unsurprisingly, with the French, which contains its own little irony.
It does, really.
Because in the 11th century, the Normans and the French are not the same thing, and you would have insulted either if you made that equation.
Yeah, the Normans are more Scandinavian than French, so...
Yeah, they are. So there was a wave of interest in the 19th century in Britain in everything Anglo-Saxon, and quite a bit of anti-Norman feeling. Books about Anglo-Saxon heroes became hugely popular, and in 1865, one of the big bestsellers was a book about an Anglo-Saxon rebel named Hereward the Wake, who defied William the Conqueror. The Anglo-Saxon craze even led people to give their children very Anglo-Saxon-sounding names. And I'm not talking just about relatively familiar ones like Alfred and Edith, but also some pretty unusual ones like Egbert and Ethelwyn.
Ah, old English names, the delight of all those who teach survey courses on England in the early Middle Ages. To quote Sellers and Yeatman, soon after, the brutal Saxon invaders drove the Britons westward into Wales and compelled them to become Welsh. Egg-kings were found on the thrones of all these kingdoms, such as Egbert, Egbreath, Eggfroth, etc. None of them, however, succeed in becoming memorable, except insofar as it is difficult to forget such names as Egbert, Eggbread, Eggbeard, Eggfish, etc. Nor is it even remembered by what kind of egg death they perished. End of quote. I actually really do like the name Ethelwyn.
Ethelwyn is a pretty good name, it's going to mark you out as having been born at a particular moment. A little bit like some of the trendier names we see today.
And we can't forget the role played by Sir Walter Scott in all of this.
I am never going to downplay the importance of Walter Scott. His novel Ivanhoe takes place during the reign of Richard the Lionheart, which is a little more than a century after the Norman Conquest. It's about an Anglo-Saxon nobleman named Sir Wilfrid of Ivanhoe and his quest to recover his lost inheritance and marry the fair Lady Rowena. In the story, Anglo-Saxons and Normans are still at odds with each other, even though the conquest is very old news by this point. As I mentioned, it's over a century in the past. But in the novel, there is still a sort of Anglo-Saxon old guard out there, almost a guerrilla movement, a resistance movement, people who want to overthrow the upstart Norman dynasty and put a genuine English claimant on the throne. Now, there isn't a surviving Anglo-Saxon claimant to the throne in the 1190s, partly because that actually is Richard the Lionheart at a certain level, because of the marriage between Henry I of England, the youngest son of William the Conqueror, and Matilda, daughter of Malcolm Canmore and Matilda. So the two royal lines have in fact been united, but Walter Scott doesn't care about that. He wants to represent England as divided along ethnic lines because it helps to drive his plot, and it also fits the prevailing mood of the country in the 19th century. They want to see this polarization because it's going to do work for them. The English public ate this up. They wanted to cheer for the Anglo-Saxons and hiss at the Normans.
And Scott also, in Ivanhoe, introduces Robin Hood. He doesn't actually name Robin Hood, but he introduces Robin Hood as a champion of the oppressed Saxon peasants. And I think that, at least for most Americans, they have been exposed to the idea of the Norman yoke through Robin Hood movies. My favorite Robin Hood movie is still the 1938 Adventures of Robin Hood with Errol Flynn and Olivia de Havilland. Although the movie presents England as divided along ethnic lines, the noble Robin, who is one of the very few Saxons who have retained their lands up until now, the noble Robin's goal is to erase that line by ensuring justice for all. There is a wonderful scene in which he explains to the, up to that point, haughty Norman Lady Marion why he, Robin, a nobleman, became an outlaw. We can act this little scene out.
Sure. You're a strange man.
Strange? Because I can feel for beaten, helpless people?
No, you're strange because you want to do something about it. You're willing to defy Sir Guy, even Prince John himself, to risk your own life. And one of those men was a Norman.
Norman or Saxon, what's the matter? It's injustice I hate, not the Normans. Well, that's perfect sentiment for FDR's America on the eve of World War II. I agree with you that interest in the Norman Conquest throughout most of the 19th century was primarily cultural and was a byproduct of the revived interest in all things Anglo-Saxon. But by the late 19th century, it had also become political once more, with the Whigs championing Harold Godwinson and the Tories William the Conqueror. For Victorian historians, the key question was the role played by the Norman Conquest in the development of that most perfect governmental system the world has ever known. I mean, of course, the English Constitution. In other words, was the Norman Conquest a good thing or a bad thing? The opposing sides are best represented by Edward Augustus Freeman and John Horace Round. Both were gentlemen historians, although Freeman eventually landed the prized position of Regius Professor of Modern History at Oxford University in 1884, and Round was awarded an honorary LLD by the University of Edinburgh in 1905. The single greatest testament to the revived interest in the Norman Conquest in this period is Edward Augustus Freeman's 6th-volume, The History of the Norman Conquest of England, Its Causes and Its Results, published between 1867 and 1879. This is a massive work, comprising 4,363 pages. Freeman was only interested in political history and drew almost exclusively upon the narrative primary sources over which he had complete mastery. He also was extremely familiar with topography and recent archaeology. The result is impressive and frankly pretty unreadable. As historian D.J.A. Matthews observed, Freeman's The Norman Conquest remains, quote, one of the most cited but least read historical monuments written on any historical subject, end quote. Virtually every historian writing on the Norman Conquest today has dipped into Freeman's work for details about topography and chronology, but I don't know any who has actually sat down and read all 5 volumes. But maybe I am just projecting. What makes Freeman controversial today has less to do with his lack of objectivity, his teleological approach to history, and his uncritical reliance on primary sources, but his racism. Even the most ardent opponents of wokeness would be appalled at Freeman's printed comments about the barbarity and ignorance of inferior races such as the blacks and the Irish. At least they hoped they would. And it's kind of ironic that the great champion of liberalism in late 19th century England was also a proud and unapologetic racist. But back to Freeman as historian. Freeman was what is called a Whig historian. Whig as in W-H-I-G, not W-I-G, referring, of course, to the 19th century Liberal British Party. In Whig historiography, the Norman Conquest was a bad thing, but fortunately one that only temporarily derailed the triumph of the English parliamentary system and democratic liberalism. Ironically, Freeman's love of all things Germanic and his hostility toward the Normans tended to undercut the importance of the subject of his work. The Norman Conquest, for Freeman, could not be a turning point in English history, but at most a speed bump. The conquest was to be regretted as an event which threatened to wipe out English national identity and political institutions. Freeman lamented the death of Harold as, quote, the overthrow, but what we know to have been only the imperfect and temporary overthrow of our ancient and free Teutonic England, end quote. But it's important to note the word temporary. Freeman's theme in the 5 volumes is the survival and resurgence of the ancient Germanic liberties of the English people. Because Freeman adopted Matthew Arnold's view of history as both continuous and cyclical, he began his work with the coming of the Anglo-Saxons, whom he saw as having wiped out or driven out the native Celts, thus establishing Saxon England as a fully Germanic society. He concluded the 5th volume, volume 6 is just a massive index, with the Angevin kings Henry II and his sons John and Richard. For Freeman, as for Arnold, history is cyclical, and Angevin England saw the revival of England's ancient liberties enshrined in the Magna Carta. I cannot too often repeat, Freeman concluded, for the saying is the very summing up of the whole history, that the Norman Conquest was not the wiping out of the Constitution, the laws, the language, the national life of Englishmen, end quote. Due to his adherence to Arnold's idea of the unity of history, Freeman provided a more nuanced interpretation of the role played by the conquest in the development of the English Constitution. As Vicky Randall points out, Freeman was keen to stress that the Normans, like the Danes before them, were of the same race as the Anglo-Saxons, and this hastened the process by which the conquerors and conquered were blended together. For Freeman, it was equally critical that the conquest did not bring about any revolution in the laws, institutions, and administration of the country. William, Freeman wrote, quote, almost alone among conquerors conquered neither to destroy nor to found, but to continue, end quote. And not only did the conquest preserve, but it promoted national unity. The conquest increased the power of the king and ensured that the nobility of England would be subjects of the crown. Even the horrifying harrying of the north was part of the process that led to a unified kingdom, as it settled once and for all the question of the division between north and south. For Freeman, the Norman conquest in itself may have been a bad thing, but it was also a necessary thing for the eventual establishment of English parliamentary democracy. The most damaging as well as most influential attack on Freeman's interpretation of the Norman conquest was launched by John Horace Round after Freeman's death in 1892. Round was a careful and meticulous historian, but he was also a ferocious critic of those whom he saw as less careful and of those with whom he disagreed. To Round, Freeman was a prime example of both. Round took as much pleasure in cataloging Freeman's factual errors as Samuel Clemens did in critiquing James Fenimore Cooper's infelicities of style. To be fair, Freeman was no kinder to those historians with whom he disagreed or whom he caught making errors. So there's a certain karma in Round's declaration that, quote, we have weighed the Norman Conquest, the book, in the balance in which he weighed the works of others, and we have found it wanting, end quote. But it wasn't Freeman's factual errors that Round found truly offensive, but his political stance. Round was as committed a Tory as Freeman was a Whig. Round dismissed Freeman's democratic politics as, quote, dangerous nonsense incarnate, and his portrayal of Anglo-Saxon England as, quote, fantasies of a brain viewing plain facts through a mist of moots and weeton. We have in it what can only be termed history in masquerade, end quote. If Freeman would have gladly stood with Harold on the ridge at Hastings, Round would just as eagerly have charged up the hill with William. For Round, the Norman conquest was a necessary corrective to the excessive liberty of the Anglo-Saxons. The Norman conquest for him was a cataclysmic event, but a cataclysmic event in a good way, marking the end of the inferior Anglo-Saxon system of government and introducing into England not only a new and better ruling class, but one with new and better customs and institutions, most notably feudalism, and those institutions defined medieval England and laid the foundations for the modern nation. The debate over the impact and importance of the Norman conquest was taken up by subsequent generations of historians, and it's still ongoing, as we're going to see. But I'm going to give the last word here to Sellers and Yeatman, with the sentiment with which I think both Freeman and Round might have agreed. Quote, the Norman conquest was a good thing, as from this time onwards, England stopped being conquered and thus was able to become top nation, end quote. But enough of historiography. We need to get to the actual historical significance of the Norman conquest.
Given how long we've gone so far, maybe save that for a follow-on episode?
Now you're beginning to sound like Ellen, but you're right. We have so much more to talk about, like the actual historical reasons why the Norman conquest is such a pivotal event in English history. And I would like to take our time exploring the changes brought about because of the conquest. I know how busy you are juggling your teaching, your administrative duties as director of Catholic University's honors program, your public lectures, and your current book project, which explores the ways in which 12th century English monastic communities used historical texts to assert various claims to power and authority. I really don't know how you do it all, but if we can sync our schedules, I'd love to release the second episode on October the 14th, the 259th anniversary of the Battle of Hastings. Let's shoot for that.
That's optimistic, but we can try.
We'll try. Meanwhile, I'd like to thank you again for joining me.
It is always a joy.
It's fun. It really is fun. Until next time, bye for now.